Welcome to the paper entitled Essentials of Symbolic Logic. Symbolic logic and classical logic. Logic is the study of methods and principles used in distinguishing correct from incorrect arguments. This does not imply that only the student of logic can make this distinction. The study of logic will help one to distinguish between valid and invalid arguments. The proper study of logic will approach it as an art as well as a science. The study of logic, especially symbolic logic, increases the proficiency in reasoning. The study of logic gives the student certain techniques for testing the validity of all arguments, including their own. This knowledge is of value because when mistakes are easily detected, they are less likely to be made. Logic has frequently been defined as a science of reasoning. This definition is not very accurate because reasoning is a special kind of thinking called inferring, where conclusions are drawn from premises. As thinking, reasoning is not the special province of logic, but part of the psychologist's subject matter as well. According to the psychologist, reasoning process is extremely complex and highly emotional, consisting of trial and error procedures that are illuminated by sudden and sometimes apparently irrelevant flashes of insight. Logicians are not interested in the actual process of reasoning, but rather with the correctness of the completed reasoning process. The concern of logicians is whether the conclusion that is reached follows from the premises used or assumed. If the premises provide adequate grounds for asserting the conclusion, that is, if asserting the premises to be true warrants asserting the conclusion to be true also, then the reasoning is correct, otherwise incorrect. Classical Aristotelian logic. Aristotle's logic, especially his theory of the syllogism, has had an unparalleled influence on the history of Western thought. In the Hellenistic period, Stoic, logic, and in particular the work of Chrysippus was the dominant form of logic. In a later period, following the work of Aristotelian commentators, Aristotle's logic became dominant, and Aristotelian logic was what was transmitted to the Arabic and the Latin medieval traditions, while the works of Chrysippus have not survived. Aristotle's logical works contain the earliest formal study of logic that is currently available. They comprise a highly developed logical theory, one that was able to command immense respect for many centuries. Kant believed that Aristotle had discovered everything there was to know about logic. The historian of logic, Brandt, went to the extent of asserting that any logician after Aristotle who said anything new was confused, stupid, or perverse. In the last century, Aristotle's reputation as a logician has undergone two remarkable reversals. The rise of modern formal logic following the work of Frege and Russell led to the recognition of many serious limitations of Aristotle's logic. Adherents of traditional logic and the new mathematical logic tended to see one another as rivals with incompatible notions of logic. At the same time, scholars trained in modern formal techniques have come to view Aristotle with new respect, not so much for the correctness of his results as for the remarkable similarity in spirit between much of his work and modern logic. More recent scholarship has often applied the very techniques of mathematical logic to Aristotle's theories, revealing a number of similarities of approach and interest between Aristotle and modern logicians. The ancient commentators of Aristotle grouped together several of Aristotle's treatises under the title Organon and regarded them as comprising his logical works. They are 1. Categories, 2. On interpretation, 3. Prior analytics, 4. Posterior analytics, 5. Topics, 6. On sophistical refutations, and 7. Rhetoric. Prepositions and sentences. A preposition is something that may be asserted or denied. Prepositions are thus different from questions, commands, and exclamations. Questions which can be asked, or commands which can be given, or exclamations that can be uttered cannot be asserted or denied. Only prepositions assert that something is or is not the case, and therefore only they can be true or false. Truth and falsity do not apply to questions, commands, or exclamations. Prepositions are to be distinguished from the sentences by means of which they are asserted. Two sentences that consist of different words that are arranged differently may be in the same context, have the same meaning, and be used to assert the same preposition. For example, Rakesh won the election. The election was won by Rakesh. The above are two different sentences, for the first to contain 4 words and the second 6, and they begin differently. Yet, these two declarative sentences have exactly the same meaning. The term preposition refers to what declarative sentences are typically used to assert. A sentence is always a sentence in a particular language, the language in which it is used. But prepositions are not peculiar to any language. A given preposition may be asserted in many languages. Arguments. Logic is chiefly concerned with arguments. Prepositions are the building blocks with which arguments are made. The term inference refers to the process by which one preposition is arrived at and affirmed on the basis of one or more other prepositions accepted as the starting points of the process. To determine whether an inference is correct, the logician examines the prepositions with which that process begins and ends, and the relations between them. This cluster of prepositions constitutes an argument, and therefore, there is an argument corresponding to every possible inference. An argument is any group of prepositions of which one is claimed to follow from the others, which are regarded as providing support or grounds for the truth of that one. An argument is not a mere collection of prepositions. A passage may contain several related prepositions and yet contain no argument at all. For an argument to be present, the cluster of prepositions must have a structure. In describing the structure, the terms premise and conclusion are commonly used. The conclusion of an argument is the preposition that is affirmed on the basis of the other prepositions of the argument, and these other prepositions which are affirmed or assumed as providing support or reasons for accepting the conclusion are the premises of that argument. Deduction and induction. Every argument makes the claim that its premises provide grounds for the truth of its conclusion. The deductive and inductive are the two major classes of arguments which differ fundamentally in the way in which their conclusions are supported by their premises. A deductive argument makes the claim that its conclusion is supported by its premises conclusively. In contrast, an inductive argument does not make such a claim. When an argument makes the claim that its premises provide irrefutable grounds for the truth of its conclusion, that claim will either be correct or incorrect. If it is correct, then that argument is valid. If incorrect, then that argument is invalid. To say that a deductive argument is valid is to say that it is not possible for its conclusion to be false if its premises are true. The central task of deductive logic is to discriminate valid arguments from invalid ones. Inductive arguments do not claim that their premises, even if true, support their conclusions with certainty. Their premises support their conclusions with probability. The criterion for validity and invalidity applicable to deductive arguments do not hold for inductive arguments. Inductive arguments are neither valid nor invalid. Since an inductive argument can yield no more than some degree of probability for its conclusion, it is always possible that additional information will strengthen or weaken it. Logic and language. Logic is concerned with arguments, and arguments contain prepositions or statements as their premises and conclusions. These premises and conclusions are not linguistic entities such as declarative sentences, but are rather what declarative sentences are typically uttered to assert. However, the communication of prepositions and arguments requires the use of language, and arguments formulated in English or any other natural language are difficult to appraise because of the vague and equivocal nature of the words in which they are expressed, the ambiguity of their construction, the misleading idioms they may contain, and their pleasing but deceptive metaphorical style. Even when these problems are resolved, the problem of deciding the validity and invalidity of the argument still remains. 20th century philosophers have elaborated in great detail the variety of uses of language. In his philosophical investigations, Ludwig Wittgenstein insisted that there are countless different kinds of use of what we call symbols, words, sentences. Among the examples suggested by Wittgenstein are giving orders, describing the appearance of an object, or giving measurements, reporting an event, speculating about an event, forming and testing a hypothesis, presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams, making up a story, play acting, singing, guessing riddles, making a joke, solving problems in practical arithmetic, translating from one language into another, asking, thinking, cursing, greeting, and praying. The three basic functions of language. The variety of language uses can be broadly classified into three general categories: the informative, the expressive, and the directive. The first of these uses is to communicate information. This is accomplished by formulating and affirming or denying prepositions. Language used to affirm or deny prepositions or to present arguments is said to be serving the informative function. Language is used to express emotions, feelings, or attitudes besides communicating information. Here, language serves the expressive function. Not all expressive language is poetry. We express sorrow by saying, "That's too bad," or "What a pity," and enthusiasm by exclaiming, "Terrific" or "Fantastic." Expressive discourse is used either to manifest the speaker's feelings or to evoke certain feelings in the auditor, or both. Expressive discourse is neither true nor false. Language serves the deductive function when it is intended to cause or to prevent overt action. The best examples are commands and requests. The language here is intended to get results. A directive discourse is also neither true nor false. Actual use of language often demands language to serve multiple functions. The ceremonial use of language, which often involves a mixture of expressive and directive discourse, is a good example of a mixed language use. In some context, the utterance of some words actually constitutes an important act. For example, at the end of a marriage ceremony, when the minister of magistrates says, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," those words are much more than a mere report of what the speaker is doing and constitutes an act. This is an instance of the performative use of language. Emotive language and its impact. A sentence, in order to perform the informative function, must formulate a preposition, and to do that its words must have literal or descriptive meaning referring to objects or events and to their attributes or relations. When the sentence expresses an attitude or feeling, some of its words may also have emotional suggestiveness or impact. A word or phrase can have both a literal meaning and an emotional impact. The expressive use of language is just as legitimate as the informative and emotive language has its due place as in neutral language. But in an argument where factual truth is the objective, neutral language is to be prized. When we are trying to learn what really the case is or trying to follow an argument, distractions are frustrating and emotion is a powerful distraction. Passions tend to cloud reason, and when we are trying to reason about facts in a cool and objective fashion, referring to them is strongly emotive language is a hindrance rather than a help. Language that is altogether neutral and free of emotional charge may not be available when we deal with controversial matters. For example, in the discussions of the rights and wrongs of abortion, the key terms used by one's opponents are very likely to be held emotionally distorting, and there may be no fully dispassionate terms acceptable as value neutral to both parties. The birth of symbolic logic. It is the multiplicity of language uses and the difficulties created by emotional loading that rendered language increasing unfit for deducing validity or invalidity of arguments, and it is this challenge that triggered the birth of modern symbolic logic, where the difficulties of language formulation in arguments are overcome by the process of symbolization. To avoid the peripheral difficulties connected with ordinary language, workers in the various sciences have developed specialized technical vocabularies. The scientist economizes the space and time required for writing his reports and theories by adopting special symbols to express ideas that would otherwise require a long sequence of familiar words to formulate. This has the further advantage of reducing the amount of attention needed. For when a sentence or equation grows too long, its meaning is difficult to grasp. The introduction of the exponent symbol in mathematics permits the expression of the equation a into 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 a is equal to b into b into b into b into b into b into b. More briefly and intelligibly as a raised to 12 is equal to b raised to 7. An advantage similar to this has been obtained by the use of graphic formulas in organic chemistry. The language of every advanced science has been enriched by similar symbolic innovations. A special technical notation has been developed for logic as well. Aristotle made use of certain abbreviations to facilitate his own investigations. Modern symbolic logic augmented this base by the introduction of many more special symbols. Modern symbolic logic has become immeasurably more powerful a tool for analysis and deduction through the development of its own technical language. The special symbols of modern logic permit us to exhibit with greater clarity the logic structures of arguments that may be obscured by formulation in ordinary language. It is easier to divide arguments into valid and invalid when they are expressed in a special symbolic logic, for with symbols the peripheral problems of vagueness, ambiguity, idiom, metaphor and ambivoly do not arise. The introduction and use of special symbols serve not only to facilitate the appraisal of arguments, but also to clarify the nature of deductive inference. The following is an illustration of how a complex argument in a natural language can be translated into the symbolism of modern symbolic logic. Either the Attorney General has imposed a strict censorship, or if Black mailed the letter, then Davis received a warning. If our lines of communication have not broken down completely, then if Davis received a warning, then Emory was informed about the matter. If the Attorney General has imposed a strict censorship, then our lines of communication have broken down completely. Our lines of communication have not broken down completely. Therefore, if Black mailed the letter, then Emory was informed about the matter. It may be symbolized as A or B implies D, negation C implies D implies E, A implies C, negation C, therefore, B implies E. The logician's special symbols are much better adapted to the actual drawing of inferences than in ordinary language. The drawing of inferences and the evaluation of arguments is greatly facilitated by the adoption of a special logical notation. Alfred North Whitehead, in an Introduction to Mathematics, Oxford University Press, 1911, says, "By the aid of symbolism, we can make transitions in reasoning almost mechanically by the eye, which otherwise would call into play the higher faculties of the brain." Since the 1840s, symbolic logic has developed along two different historical paths. One of them began with the English mathematician George Boole, 1815 to 1864. Boole applied algebraic notations and methods first to symbolize and then to validate arguments of the kind studied by Aristotle in the 4th century BC. This may be characterized as an effort to apply mathematical notations and methods to traditional non-mathematical kinds of arguments. The other path began with the independent efforts of the English mathematician Augustus De Morgan, 1806 to 1871, and the American scientist and philosopher Charles Peirce, 1839 to 1914, to devise a very precise notation for relational arguments. These two historical paths coalesced in the works of German mathematician and philosopher Gottlob Frege, 1849 to 1925, the Italian mathematician Giuseppe Peano, 1858 to 1932, and the English philosophers Alfred North Whitehead, 1861 to 1947, and Bernard Russell, 1872 to 1970, whose Principia Mathematica was an important landmark in the history of symbolic logic. Now, let us summarize. Logic is an art as well as a science. The study of logic, especially symbolic logic, increases the proficiency in reasoning. The study of logic gives the student certain techniques for testing the validity of all arguments, including their own. Aristotle's logic, especially his theory of the syllogism, has had an unparalleled influence on the history of Western thought. Prepositions assert that something is or is not the case, and therefore, only they can be true or false. Truth and falsity do not apply to questions, commands or exclamations. Prepositions are the building blocks with which arguments are made. The term inference refers to the process by which one preposition is arrived at and affirmed on the basis of one or more other prepositions accepted as the starting points of the process. The deductive and inductive are the two major classes of arguments which differ fundamentally in the way in which their conclusions are supported by their premises. The communication of prepositions and arguments requires the use of language, and arguments formulated in English or any other natural language are difficult to appraise because of the vague and equivocal nature of the words in which they are expressed, the ambiguity of the construction, the misleading idioms they may contain, and their pleasing but deceptive metaphorical style. It is the multiplicity of language uses and the difficulties created by emotional loading that rendered language increasingly unfit for deducing validity or invalidity of arguments, and it is this challenge that triggered the birth of modern symbolic logic, where the difficulties of language formulation in arguments are overcome by the process of symbolization. Here are some questions for you to work out. 1. Examine the scope and objectives of the study of logic. 2. Trace the origin and development of classical Aristotelian logic. 3. Distinguish between a sentence and a preposition. 4. What are the functions of language? What is the impact of the presence of emotive words in arguments? 5. What are the advantages of symbolization? There are some books for your further reference. Symbolic Logic, 5th edition by Copy Irving M., Darling Kindersley Publishing, 2006. Introduction to Logic, 11th edition by Copy Irving M., Prentice Hall of India, 2005. An Introduction to Mathematics by Whitehead A. N., Oxford University Press, 1911. An Introduction to Symbolic Logic, 3rd edition by Langer Susanna K., Dover Publications, 1967. Logic, a very short introduction by Priest Graham, Oxford University Press, 2000. Thank you for watching this session. See you next time. Until then, bye.